Good day, students. Welcome back. This is Unit 3D as part of Equality Management 4. It's grouped within the Unit 3 because it deals with control as applicable to engineering control. This is legislative control. So we will deal with quite a number of slides explaining the legislation applicable to specifically equality management. Again, very briefly, just remember also the definitions like we did in Unit 1, and also when we dealt with engineering control, it's very much applicable also to the legislation. Remember for occupational, the definition, the Occupational Health and Safety Act applies, and for equality or air pollution issues, the legislation that we will discuss today is applicable, namely the National Environmental Management Equality Act. Just a quick refresher on occupational exposure. I'm not really going to go into detail as far as this is concerned. This is just for your noting. The slide reflects the definition for ambient or atmospheric air pollution. I'm not going to go through this slide again. It's been discussed at various units in the previous presentations. Just to remind you about the last sentence, that in our country, if you sample and you get results, you compare that to ambient standards in South Africa. We will deal with that in detail later on during this presentation. Just a quick slide on the sources. Remember, there's a vast range of sources, and all of these sources must be controlled by legislation. So it can be industries, it can be point sources like power stations, it can be even mining where you do blasting, and then lastly also moving traffic is also a source that is applicable here. One source of air pollution that is very difficult to control relates to residential pollution. We feel mostly coal, low-grade coal, is used for cooking and heating purposes, and that also needs to be reflected in legislation. Most of us are familiar with this type of space heating and cooking equipment. Your paraffin stoves that is widely used, and that also generate air pollutants, specifically or volatile organic compounds that in most cases are classified as carcinogenic. This slide is just a quick slide on again to remind you on the pollutants of concern from international point of view, called international criteria pollutants. That's got the pollutants that's got the most serious effect on health. And you will also see that our legislation that we will discuss later on is also linked to this international criteria pollutants. We've dealt with this slide in much more detail when we did the health effects as part of, I think, Module 2. Please again also be reminded about the, what the definition entails for, ambient or atmospheric air pollution. Remember the first bullet there, lower concentrations, so equipment very expensive, long-term monitoring, permanent exposure, your plume from your emissions from a stack, once it's released, it's uncontrollable, therefore it needs to be sampled, and the legislation is focusing on stack sampling. We'll talk about that. Multi-source contribution, sophisticated monitoring equipment, we talk about that. There's stack limits, licensing in our case in South Africa that we will deal in detail. And then we've also got the National Ambient Equality Standards that's been promulgated in terms of the National Environmental Management Equality Act. And there's the list of published national ambient standards. The reason for this slide is to just indicate to you that there's, if you talk about legal control, there's two areas that you need to control. First one is the sources. That's the bottom part of the triangle. Various sources like point sources, residential sources, and also motor vehicles, and then your mine dumps in terms of area sources. And then on the other hand, you sit with the receptors that receive the pollution, and that can be human beings, plants, animals, and structures. Although we focus on human health. So it is important that for the sources side, that you generate some form of control. In our country, for the point sources, we've got a licensing system where you need the atmospheric emission license for certain processes. And then for the others, you will find that there's regulations. And then on the other hand, on the receptor side, that's where the ambient air quality monitoring comes into place, where we've got the ambient standards for the pollutants, and you sample then in the ambient environment that we've dealt with in this module as well, ambient sampling, to sample what communities, individuals, communities are exposed to in the environment. And that tool that you monitor the receptors is only there to give you a good indication. You cannot really pinpoint and prosecute individual industries there, but if you go back to the sources, that's where you've got the necessary control. Let us just for a moment focus on the old legislation dated from 1965 that was repealed in 2004. I'll just, the next slide will just give you a very brief summary of what the legislation was in the past. I'm not going to give any detail because the total legislation has been repealed in total. The previous legislation was, to say the least, totally outdated. It was, fragmented. The so-called industry regulation was done by the Department of Health. The Department of Health was the regulating authority, the custodian for air pollution. And then municipalities only had a small control, and that was to control smoke from certain areas that's been designated as smoke control areas. There was no licensing process, but listed activities and then a registration certificate. And that was based on best practicable means, so there was no emission standards available, so it was to the discretion of the air pollution control officer of the national department to negotiate the license conditions. And the legislation was purely reacting. It wasn't proactive, so it was reacting to problems. There was no proactive management as far as that is concerned. Let's focus our attention now to the present legislation, and see how that differs now from the old approach, where it's now more a proactive approach. The tools we will discuss during the slides to follow. Any piece of legislation goes through a legal process before it actually becomes a legislation. Just as a little bit of a background before this slide, after 1994, with the new democratic dispensation, the government decided that almost all the legislation needs to go through a law reform process. because it was written for the old apartheid times, and it doesn't meet the requirements of the constitution, with the rights for individuals and the right to a clean environment, etc. So the old Air Pollution Prevention Act of 1965 was also rewritten into a new piece of legislation to make sure that it's aligned to the constitution as well as the international practices in the world as far as equality is concerned. The implementation process started there was a lot of consultations before 2004, but it served in Parliament in August 2004, and the President, it was then President Mbeki, assented to the legislation in February 2005, and then the Minister implemented, the Minister of Environmental Affairs implemented the legislation on the 11th of September 2005. But certain sections of the Act was excluded. The old APA was still valid or applicable for these sections, and that mainly dealt with the listing, the listing activities and also the licensing processes. Remember that air quality became a local matter in terms of the constitution, so it became the responsibility of municipalities. In the past, with the old legislation, the municipalities had almost no control over air pollution. So the capacity was lacking at municipalities, and there was a 5-year period where the government went on a steep, a learning curve, and also capacity building at municipalities, where municipal officers were trained and capacitated to enforce the new legislation. A lot of the environmental health practitioners also came over and were also trained on to become a equality officer and to be able to issue and enforce the new Equality Act. And then finally, in March 2010, the Atmospheric Pollution Prevention Act was totally repealed, and from the 1st of April, not an April's Fool joke this, but on the 1st of April 2010, then the new Act came into full force with all the sections of the legislation being implemented. The legislation consists of 9 chapters, and we will deal with each chapter individually. There's a chapter on the fundamental principles, then your framework and standards, and then chapter 3 deals with planning, institutional planning, and then equality management, and then licensing, international equality, and then your offences and penalties, and general matters, and then concludes with chapter 9 on other few issues that we will touch on in this presentation. Now, in essence, if you need to summarize the Equality Act, what is really the key issues in terms of the National Environmental Management Equality Act? In other words, how does it contribute to effective policing and effective management of air quality? The equality functions has been devolved to provinces, and then metros and district municipalities. Provinces play more overseeing function, where the real implementation happens at the metros and the district municipal levels, where you will find very strong equality capacity, and some of the environmental health practitioners also works for metros and district municipalities, even for provinces, also work within the function of equality. There's, from the old approach to the new approach, there's a change. It's now more proactive. In other words, you plan ahead, and what you plan, you manage. And if you need to monitor, you conduct scientific monitoring and evaluation. and that you can then benchmark or compare to gazetted national ambient equality standards. The third bullet is also your regulation and the management is through what we call equality management plans. That was by the way my topic when I did my doctorate study. I did it on equality management plans. From my study I developed a framework for equality management plans for the national government, provincial government, and then also your municipal level, because the legislation was by then very generic in terms of what needs to be in a equality management plan. It also requires the fourth bullet that equality officers needs to be designated. It is a legal requirement. So you will always find an appointed equality officer in terms of the Equality Act at each metro and district municipality, and at provincial and at national level. And then there's also enabling section in the legislation that deals with the promulgation of regulations and standards for the assessment of implementation. And then higher level equality functions is dealt with on a national level. The development of the equality management plan is a strategic document, and it also ties in and forms part of the integrated development plans of municipalities, so that it forms part of the total integration. And it doesn't. It's not only a standalone document. The development of the management equality monitoring networks. We've dealt with the ambient sampling, the commissioning and the data management and reporting. There's also outflow from the new legislation, and then the licensing specifically. There's a whole chapter on emission licensing of your listed activities. And then also there's regulations that can be made for controlled emitters, and there's a few already been promulgated. There's a specific regulation dealing with the control of smaller boilers, and a copy of this regulations you will also find on your resource kit under the applicable folder on My Tutor. Then the implementation of equality reduction strategies with priority sectors. The legislation also makes provision for the provinces and the minister on a national level to declare certain areas priority areas, and that the definition of that, the requirement to be declared a priority area is when the equality in that specific area does not meet the national ambient equality standards. And if that happens, then the area will be declared a priority area, and then it will be focused on this area, to manage equality, to bring down the emissions within the limits of the national ambient equality standards. Then the reduction strategies need to follow. If you've got a priority area, you also need to put in reduction strategies. And then also physical inspections of listed activities. If you've got a license, you will be policed, the industries. That is normally done in collaboration with the EMIs, or the so-called green scorpions, environmental management inspectors, as part of the compliance monitoring function. And in most cases, they will also include a technical specialist on equality, to assist the EMIs, because they're not all specialists in equality management. Let us deal now with the Equality Act per chapter. Now, the first chapter is normally the introduction chapter. In this chapter, it's normally the definitions. If you've got a specific terminology in the legislation, you can find a definition for that in the legislation. In the objective of the act, is protect and enhance equality, and then also reduce the risks. It also contains the duty of the government, of the state, that the state is not exempted from equality. They also need to comply. And then where does the Equality Act apply? It applies to the total border, the total area of South Africa, and it also includes some distance into the sea, called the exclusive zone, and the continental shelf. That's between 100 to 200 sea miles into the sea. So that's also the air pollution from vessels or ships also can be controlled in terms of the Equality Act. And then also, as part of bullet point number 4 there, it also binds all the organs of state. So there's no exemptions. Government must also fully comply to the legislation. And then bullet number 5 is also very important, because remember, the mother law of the environment is the National Environmental Management Act, NEMA, and that's got certain principles, and that principles, for instance, a principle on the polluter pay principle, the cradle to grave principle. There's a number of these principles. They also apply to the Equality Act as is. So if somebody pollute the environment by means of air pollution, that company will also have to pay to clean up or decrease the air pollution. And then there's just the last section also on if there's conflict with other legislation, who prevails. If there's provincial legislation, for instance, that it gets resolved in terms of the constitution. And then if there's a municipal bylaw, then the National Environmental Management Equality Act will prevail in that instance. So the municipalities cannot go over and above the requirements of the Equality Act.